In the autumn of 1943, as the leaves turned gold across the French countryside and the war dragged into its fourth brutal year, the Allied forces were planning something unprecedented. The railway networks of occupied France had become lifelines for the German war machine, but they could also serve a different purpose, one that required extraordinary courage and meticulous planning. What follows is the story of Train 714, a supply convoy that would become one of the war's most enduring mysteries, and the truth that lay buried beneath the earth for more than 50 years. The operation began in London, in a nondescript building near Westminster, where the Special Operations Executive maintained its headquarters. It was there, on the morning of October 3, 1943, that Colonel James Harrington received orders that would change the course of hundreds of lives. The mission seemed straightforward on paper: a supplied train disguised as a standard German logistics convoy would carry medical supplies, including desperately needed penicillin, surgical equipment, and blood plasma, to resistance fighters and Allied operatives hidden throughout occupied France. But this was no ordinary shipment. Among the medical crates were hidden compartments containing intelligence documents, radio equipment, and something far more valuable: a list of every known collaborator in the Vichy government, information that could reshape the political landscape of post-war France. The plan required the cooperation of the French resistance, the corruption of several German railway officials, and the nerves of steel possessed by only a select few. The train would depart from a rail yard in Strasbourg, a city that had been absorbed into the Third Reich and renamed. From there, it would travel westward through occupied France, making several scheduled stops at German checkpoints before reaching its true destination, a secret resistance stronghold in the forests near Limoges. The entire journey would take approximately 18 hours, and every minute of it would be orchestrated down to the smallest detail.
The crew assembled for this mission was as diverse as it was brave. There was Captain Ernst Müller, a German railway officer who had grown disillusioned with the Nazi regime after witnessing the deportation of his Jewish neighbors in Hamburg. He had been secretly feeding information to the Allies for nearly a year, and this would be his most dangerous assignment yet. Alongside him was Marie Duchamp, a French resistance fighter who had lost her husband and 2 sons to the Gestapo. She would pose as a German administrative clerk, her fluent German and forged papers granting her access to areas where few French civilians dared to tread. There was also Private Thomas Webb, a British SOE operative who had parachuted into France 6 months earlier and had been living under the identity of a Belgian railway worker. Together with a handful of carefully selected resistance fighters and 2 more compromised German officers, they would form the crew of Train 714. The train itself was a modified freight locomotive, a Deutsche Reichsbahn Class 52 Kriegslok, one of the thousands of wartime locomotives built to supply the vast German war effort. It pulled 12 freight cars, each painted in the standard German military gray and bearing the proper Wehrmacht markings. The first 3 cars contained actual German military supplies, legitimate cargo that would pass any inspection. The next 6 cars held the medical supplies and hidden contraband. The final 3 cars were empty, or so the manifest claimed. But in reality, they contained a small group of British and American prisoners of war who were being smuggled out of France to eventually make their way back to Allied lines. On the evening of October 17, 1943, train 714 departed from Strasbourg right on schedule. The weather was overcast, with a light rain falling, the kind of dreary autumn night that made German sentries huddle in their guardhouses rather than conduct thorough inspections. Captain Mueller sat in the locomotive's cabin, his hand steady on the controls, his mind racing through every possible contingency. Marie Duchamp sat beside him, her forged papers tucked inside her coat, a cyanide capsule hidden in a false tooth should the worst come to pass. Private Webb moved through the freight cars, checking on the hidden prisoners, distributing water and what little food they could spare.
The first checkpoint came at Saverne, a town nestled in the Vosges Mountains. The inspection was routine. German soldiers glanced at the manifest, checked the lead cars, and waved them through after Mueller exchanged pleasantries and shared cigarettes with the commanding sergeant. The same pattern repeated at Nancy, where the inspection was even more cursory. The guards were cold, wet, and eager to return to their warm barracks. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. But war is a realm of chaos, and even the most meticulous plans can unravel in an instant. As train 714 approached the town of Toul, roughly halfway through its journey, an unexpected complication arose. A genuine German supply convoy had been ambushed by resistance fighters just 20 kilometers south, and in response, the Wehrmacht had ordered all rail traffic in the region to be stopped and thoroughly searched. Every train, every cargo shipment, and every piece of rolling stock was to be inspected with unprecedented scrutiny. The order came through on the radio just as Mueller was guiding the train past the outskirts of Toul. For several agonizing minutes, the crew debated their options. They could attempt to bluff their way through, relying on Mueller's rank and credentials. They could try to bypass the checkpoint entirely, though that would immediately raise suspicions. Or they could abandon the train and scatter into the countryside, though that would mean losing the cargo and likely condemning the hidden prisoners to death. It was Marie who made the decision. She had been communicating with resistance cells via coded radio messages, and she knew of an alternative route, an old maintenance line that branched off from the main track approximately 8 kilometers ahead. The line had been used before the war to service a limestone quarry and ran through a series of tunnels carved into the hillside. It was rarely used now, possibly forgotten by the German railway authorities. If they could reach it and disappear into those tunnels before the Germans realized they had deviated from their route, they might have a chance.
Mueller pushed the locomotive harder, the great machine straining as it picked up speed. Behind them, the lights of Toul receded into the rain-soaked darkness. Private Webb moved through the cars, warning everyone to brace themselves and remain absolutely silent. Marie worked the radio, sending coded messages to resistance cells along their projected path, alerting them to the change in plans. The junction appeared ahead, barely visible in the gloom, marked only by a rusted signal box that no longer functioned. Mueller threw the switch manually, and the train lurched onto the sidetrack, the wheels squealing in protest as they navigated the sharp turn. The tunnel entrance loomed before them, a black mouth carved into the limestone hillside.
It was narrower than the main line tunnels, and for a terrible moment, Müller feared the train might not fit. But the engineers of the Third Republic had built well, and the locomotive plunged into the darkness, the sound of the engines suddenly deafening as it echoed off the close stone walls. They traveled for what felt like an eternity, but was actually only about 6 minutes, the tunnel twisting and turning as it followed the natural contours of the rock. Emergency lamps flickered on in the freight cars, casting strange shadows. The prisoners huddled together, certain that this was some new form of torture, unable to comprehend what was happening. And then something occurred that no one could have anticipated. Deep within the tunnel, at a point where it descended sharply to pass beneath a ridge, the track ahead simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not damaged, but deliberately removed. In the beam of the locomotive's headlamp, Müller saw the gap too late. He slammed on the brakes, the wheels locking, sparks flying in the darkness as metal scraped against metal. But the momentum of 12 loaded freight cars behind a heavy locomotive cannot be stopped quickly. The train lurched forward, and for one sickening moment, it seemed as though they might plunge into the darkness of the incomplete tunnel. But fate, or perhaps the skill of French engineers decades past, intervened. The floor of the tunnel at that point sloped downward at a gentle angle, forming a natural ramp. The locomotive's front wheels left the rails and dug into the packed earth and gravel of the tunnel floor, acting as a brake more effective than any mechanical system. The train shuddered to a halt, tilted at a 15-degree angle, the cars behind it accordioning slightly, but not derailing catastrophically. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the hiss of steam and the groans of stressed metal, the crew took stock of their situation.
They were trapped. Behind them, the tunnel stretched back toward the junction and the German-controlled railway. Ahead, the tunnel continued into darkness, but without rails there was no way to move the locomotive forward. They were deep inside the hillside, perhaps 200 or 300 meters of solid rock above their heads, with limited food, limited water, and dozens of people depending on them for survival. Marie's radio could not penetrate the rock to reach the surface. They were, for all intents and purposes, buried alive. Captain Müller made his way through the train, assessing the damage and checking on the passengers and crew. Remarkably, there had been no serious injuries. The prisoners, once they understood they were not being executed, actually seemed relieved to be off the rails, as it were. Several of them were engineers or mechanics in civilian life, and they immediately began examining the locomotive to determine if it could be repaired or moved. Private Webb organized the supplies, rationing what food and water they had. Marie attempted to determine their exact location based on her knowledge of the region and the time they had spent in the tunnel. What followed was a week that tested the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. The crew and prisoners worked together, their previous roles as enemies or allies becoming irrelevant in the face of their shared predicament. They discovered that the tunnel ahead did continue, and after several hours of exploration by lamplight, they found that it opened onto the side of a ravine about half a kilometer away. But the opening was partially collapsed, blocked by rubble and overgrown with vegetation. It would take days to clear it enough for a person to squeeze through, and there was no hope of extracting the train. The medical supplies that were supposed to save lives in resistance field hospitals now served a different purpose. The surgical equipment was used to perform an emergency appendectomy on one of the German crew members who fell ill on the third day.
The penicillin treated infections that arose from the minor injuries people had sustained in the rough stop. The blood plasma was carefully preserved, as if it might somehow be needed later, though for what purpose, no one could say. On the fourth day, a delegation consisting of Private Webb and 2 of the prisoners managed to clear enough of the tunnel entrance to squeeze through. They emerged to daylight on the side of a heavily forested ravine, miles from any road or village. Webb made the decision to seek help, to try to reach a resistance contact in a village he knew to be about 10 kilometers to the west. He set out alone, promising to return within 2 days.
He never did return. What happened to Private Thomas Webb remains one of the smaller mysteries within this larger tragedy. Some accounts suggest he was captured by a German patrol and executed as a spy. Others claim he reached the resistance but was killed in an unrelated skirmish before he could organize a rescue. A few romantic versions of the story have him surviving the war and living out his days in a small French village, too traumatized to ever speak of what happened in that tunnel. The truth is simply unknown. Inside the tunnel, as days stretched into a week, hope began to fade. The food was nearly gone. The water, drawn from a small underground spring they had discovered, dripping through a crack in the tunnel wall, was barely sufficient. Marie Duchamp, ever the pragmatist, began planning for the worst. She gathered the intelligence documents, the list of collaborators, the sensitive materials that had been hidden in the train's cargo. Working by lamplight, she sealed them in waterproof containers and hid them within the limestone walls of the tunnel, marking the locations with subtle signs that only someone who knew what to look for would recognize. Captain Mueller, meanwhile, made a fateful decision. If they could not move forward, and they could not go back, then perhaps they could go down. The tunnel floor in several places showed signs of earlier mining activity, places where the original quarry workers had followed veins of particularly pure limestone. Using tools salvaged from the locomotive's maintenance kit and sheer determination, a small group began excavating downward, hoping to find a lower tunnel system or perhaps another way out. It was desperate, irrational even, but it gave people something to do other than wait for death. On the 8th day, October 25, 1943, they broke through. The floor of the tunnel collapsed into a vast natural cavern below, a cathedral of stone that had existed in darkness for millions of years. The fall killed 2 men instantly, including Captain Mueller, who had been at the forefront of the excavation. But the cavern offered something unexpected, another way out. An underground river ran through the cavern, and where there is flowing water, there is eventually an exit to the surface.
The survivors, now numbering 43, made the agonizing decision to abandon the train and attempt to follow the river. They took what supplies they could carry, including as many of the medical supplies as possible. Marie insisted on carrying the remaining intelligence documents herself, refusing to leave them behind. The journey through the cavern system took 3 days, a nightmare of darkness, cold water, and narrow passages that required them to wade sometimes chest-deep through the freezing underground stream. They emerged, finally, from a cave entrance hidden by a waterfall into a remote valley far from any settlement. Of the 43 who entered the cavern, 37 survived the journey. They were found by local resistance fighters 2 days later, delirious, suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion, but alive. Marie Duchamp delivered her intelligence documents, which did indeed prove valuable to the Allied cause.
The surviving prisoners were eventually returned to Allied lines. The compromised German officers who had helped them faded into new identities, their fates lost to history. But Train 714 remained buried beneath the earth, forgotten in the chaos of war. The entrance to the old quarry tunnel was known only to a few, and those few either died in the subsequent years of fighting or chose to remain silent about what had happened. The German authorities, preoccupied with their collapsing war effort, never conducted a thorough investigation into the train's disappearance. The official record simply showed Train 714 as lost, presumed destroyed by partisan activity, one of thousands of similar incidents in occupied France. The decades passed. The war ended. France rebuilt. The forests grew thicker over the ravine where the tunnel entrance lay hidden. The old quarry line was dismantled, the junction filled in, the very existence of that sidetrack forgotten by all but the oldest railway historians. The survivors of Train 714 scattered to the winds. Some tried to tell their story, but in the chaos of post-war Europe, it was just one tale among millions, and not a particularly believable one at that. A train that vanished into a tunnel? It sounded like a ghost story, a myth, not history. Marie Duchamp lived until 1989, passing away at the age of 73 in a small apartment in Lyon. Among her effects, her grandchildren found a leather journal, filled with precise notes and hand-drawn maps, detailing everything she could remember about the tunnel, the cavern, and the location of the hidden documents. At first, they thought it was fiction, perhaps the confused recollections of an old woman. But one of her grandsons, Antoine, was an engineer with a passion for World War II history. He began to investigate.
Antoine spent 5 years researching, cross-referencing his grandmother's journal with German railway records, resistance archives, and geological surveys of the region. In 1994, he assembled a small team of explorers and historians. Using his grandmother's maps and modern ground-penetrating radar, they located the collapsed tunnel entrance on the side of that overgrown ravine. The excavation took 6 months, hampered by the unstable nature of the collapsed rock and the need to preserve any historical artifacts they might find. On March 12, 1995, 51 years after Train 714 disappeared, they broke through into the tunnel. Their flashlights revealed a scene frozen in time. The locomotive stood where it had stopped, now rusted, covered in calcium deposits from decades of water seepage, but still recognizable. The freight cars behind it were intact, their contents remarkably preserved by the cool, dry conditions of the sealed tunnel. The medical supplies were there, the boxes still stacked, though the contents had long since degraded. The empty cars that had held prisoners showed signs of habitation, improvised beds made from canvas, discarded tins, even graffiti scratched into the wooden walls in English, French, and German. But the most significant discovery came when they followed Antoine's grandmother's marks to the hidden caches she had made in the tunnel walls. The intelligence documents were there, still sealed in their waterproof containers, yellowed but readable. But there was something else, something Marie had not mentioned in her journal, perhaps because the memory was too painful. In one of the freight cars, they found a makeshift memorial, a collection of personal items arranged with obvious care. Photographs, letters, a wedding ring, a child's toy.
These were the possessions of the two men who had died in the fall into the cavern, along with mementos from several others who had not survived the underground river journey. Marie and the survivors had created this shrine before they left, a way to honor those who had given everything for a chance at freedom. The discovery of Train 714 made international news. Historians, journalists, and surviving family members descended on the site. The French government declared it a historical monument. The locomotive was eventually excavated and restored, now displayed in a museum in Limoges, near where the train had been originally headed. The tunnel itself was preserved as a memorial, with careful lighting and pathways installed so that visitors could walk alongside the freight cars and see where history had unfolded. The investigation into what happened revealed the complete story, piece by piece. Records showed that the quarry tunnel had been deliberately sabotaged by German engineers in 1942. The rails removed to prevent the resistance from using it to move supplies. But the record of this sabotage had been lost in bureaucratic confusion, and when Mueller and Marie made their desperate decision to take the sidetrack, they had no way of knowing it was a dead end. The cavern below was mapped by geologists and found to be part of an extensive limestone cave system that had been known to local people for centuries but never formally surveyed. Most poignantly, they found evidence of what happened to Private Thomas Webb. His body was discovered in 2003 during a separate archaeological survey, buried in a shallow grave near a German checkpoint about 7 kilometers from the tunnel entrance. He had been captured, interrogated, and executed on October 28, 1943, just 3 days after setting out to find help. He had died without revealing the location of the tunnel or the existence of the train, a final act of courage that had protected those he left behind, even though he never knew if they survived. The survivors of Train 714, those who lived long enough to see the tunnel rediscovered, were invited to a ceremony at the site in 1996. Only 4 could attend, elderly men and women in their 70s and 80s, who wept as they walked through the tunnel one last time, remembering friends long dead and a desperate week when nationality and uniform had ceased to matter in the face of survival. They spoke to journalists and historians, filling in details that no document could capture. The sound of the underground river in the darkness, the taste of the spring water that had kept them alive, the moment when Captain Mueller, knowing the floor might collapse, had smiled and said he supposed they would find out what lay beneath one way or another. The story of Train 714 has become more than just a historical footnote. It has become a symbol of the complexity of war, of the fact that even in the darkest times, humanity persists. The German officers who betrayed their government to save lives, the British agent who died protecting people he never even knew, the French resistance fighter who buried her grief and led strangers through the underworld, the prisoners who worked alongside their captors to survive. All of them caught in the machinery of war, making choices in the darkness of that tunnel that revealed the best of what humans can be. Today, if you visit the site, you can walk through that tunnel, though only part of it is open to the public. You can stand beside the locomotive and touch its rusted hull, feeling the cold metal beneath your fingers and trying to imagine what it must have been like to sit in that cabin, knowing that every decision could mean life or death.
You can see the memorial the survivors created, now supplemented with photographs and biographical information about every person who was on that train. You can read Marie Duchamp's journal, preserved under glass, her handwriting still clear after all these years. And if you continue through the tunnel to where the floor once collapsed into the cavern below, you will find a glass barrier now, allowing you to look down into that vast darkness. A single shaft of light has been installed, illuminating the place where Captain Mueller fell, where the desperate gamble to dig down had both succeeded and failed. A plaque there reads, in French, German, and English, "Here in darkness they found light. Here in despair they found hope. Here in death they found the measure of life." The forgotten train that vanished behind enemy lines was not forgotten after all. It was simply waiting in the darkness beneath the earth for someone to care enough to look for it, to piece together the scattered fragments of memory and documentation and geological coincidence. And in finding it, we found something more valuable than a rusted locomotive or even historical truth. We found proof that even in the worst of times, even when everything seems lost, human courage and compassion can survive, can persist, can eventually be brought back into the light where it belongs. The story of Train 714 is a story of many things, of war and resistance, of sacrifice and survival, of the chaos of history and the persistence of memory. But perhaps most of all, it is a reminder that every moment of courage, every act of kindness, every choice to do what is right, even when no one is watching, matters. These things echo through time, waiting in darkness if necessary, but never truly lost. They remain, buried but not forgotten, until the day when someone comes looking, when someone refuses to let the past simply disappear into silence. And so the train rests there still, in its tunnel beneath the French countryside, a monument to a week in October 1943, when 47 people fought for their lives in the darkness, and 37 of them won. The tunnel has given up its secret, but the earth keeps its dead, and the memory of what happened there continues to teach us about the best and worst of what we are capable of becoming when history demands everything we have to give.